What's happening, baby? It's Dallas Clark, also known as Indo is my Nindo, back at you again from the Huddle Chat Sports Show with a fantasy football huddle today for you. Now, I'm going to be straight up. I'm going to be honest with you. It's not very glamorous. It's not very spectacular. But if you want to win your fantasy football league, if you really want to dominate your fantasy football competition, well, you got to put in the work. You got to do that research. It doesn't help just to be following Bleacher Report or following Adam Schefter on Twitter or following Mike Clay. I mean, everybody does that. That's very basic fantasy football knowledge that anybody that plays fantasy football has that access to. You got to do something that gives you that extra leg up, that extra advantage over your competition that they do not have that access to, because at the end of the day, you cannot predict the future. I cannot predict the future. I don't know anybody that has that crystal ball that can predict the future and see what's really going to happen. But at the end of the day, fantasy football is all about minimizing risk, and it's a week-to-week game that we play over the course of a season. You cannot do too much research. There's no such thing as too much research when it comes to fantasy football if you truly want to dominate your league. One thing that you can most definitely do to get that extra step up, that extra leg up, that advantage above your competition, is you're already doing it right now, is checking out the Huddle Chat Sports Show fantasy football huddles. We're going to be coming out with a lot of them, especially right now. We're just kicking off the national draft weekend for fantasy football, and I've got a ton of content coming out over the next 3 to 4 days, and I'm planning on coming out with daily episodes, if not just one, multiple episodes in those days. So definitely stay tuned. When you're watching on YouTube, make sure you hit that notifications bell, because all this content is going to be coming out so fast, especially over this weekend. I'm not even going to have time to schedule it. I'm just going to be doing videos and posting them out as soon as I have them ready. So make sure you hit that notifications bell, and if you like my content, please make sure you smash that like button. But hey, enough with all the intro stuff, enough with all the announcements. Let's get kicked off right into the fantasy football knowledge. Today's episode is going to be 6 rules that you need to keep in mind while preparing for your fantasy football draft in order to dominate your fantasy football league. Now's the time, of course, I invite you, while we're getting everything started up, to smoke them if you got them. Let's get it cracking, baby. Now, 6 rules that you need to keep in mind in order to dominate your fantasy football draft. The first rule is always going to be get to know the lingo. I mean, as we go deeper and deeper into fantasy football, and as you watch more of these videos, you're going to hear a lot of my lingo, and I'm going to do my best to educate you as we go on. But fantasy football, the world of fantasy football, it's just like any other sports or sports statistic category. I mean, you really have to get to know the lingo. I mean, ADP, handcuff, streaming are just a few of the terms that you really need to know. Those are some of the most basic ones that you need to know. And off tops, I need to let you know ADP is one of the most important ones. That's the average draft position. Now, I need to let you know, of course, over here on the Fantasy Football Huddle, we do not hate players. We hate players' ADPs. When we're looking at what you have to pay to get certain players with the risk that they have attached to them, I would not be willing to pay that price for that player. Now, if that player was to fall to me to a more comfortable range, I'd be more than happy to take that player. But we don't actually hate players. We hate their ADP, their average draft position. Now, like I said, you really need to get to know that lingo. Now, rule number 2, that one's going to be a really big one. That one is going to be to know your league-specific rules. I mean, you're going to be watching me, and I do multiple different leagues myself, and there are many different platforms and many different ways to play fantasy football. You need to know when the playoffs start. You need to know what the scoring is like. You need to know how many roster positions you have. You need to know, with there now being 17 games in the season, how many weeks are going to be in the regular season. Like I said, you need to get to know, talk to your league commissioner, talk to other members in your league, and you really need to get to know the rules of your league. It does you no good going into a a league where you need to have 2 quarterbacks starting every week, and you're preparing with a running back heavy draft strategy. Like I said, getting to know your league rules are going to be very important. Me personally, when I'm talking a standard league, I play in that traditional format, a 10-man league. I know you might want to set me on fire in it, but a 10-man league. A lot of people, the average now is 12, but I still run a nice 10-man league. We've been doing it for a very long time, so we've kept the tradition to it. We do non-PPR, non-points per reception. It means that every time a wide receiver or a running back or anybody that you're starting in your fantasy football lineup catches a ball, no matter if they gain or lose yards on said reception, they gain a point plus the yardage that is attached to it. I personally don't like it that much. I do play PPR, but in our traditional league, we stay non-PPR. Like I said, as you're hearing, different leagues, different lingo, you got to learn all of that stuff. It does you no good studying up on all these players. You can be a great a person with a lot of football knowledge and still not know how to play fantasy football just by not knowing your league rules or just by not knowing the lingo. Everybody's a little bit different. Now, Rule 3 is going to be that this is not your final roster. I mean, we all have that issue. I know I've had that issue before. Everybody at some point or another in their fantasy football career has run into the issue where they sort of fall in love with players, and you kind of draft players and you spend certain draft picks on players, and you yourself are valuing that player higher than your league does. It happens to everybody. It's easy to do that, but you definitely need to understand that this will not be your final roster. I mean, 6 of the 12 most rostered players in ESPN fantasy football playoff settings last year were waiver wire pickups. You're looking at players that were not even drafted in most leagues, ended up being half of the most rostered players on the winning teams last year in fantasy football. Now, like I said, every format is different. I'm talking about ESPN fantasy football specifically. Now, when we're looking at that same category, only 2 of the top 10 most rostered players in ESPN fantasy football playoff lineups last year had ADP's average draft positions in the first 5 rounds. In rounds 1 through 5, only 2 of the 10 most rostered players had been drafted in those rounds 1 through 5. You're looking at Devontae Adams and Alvin Kamara. Everybody else were either late round pickups or waiver wire pickups. So that first 5 rounds is extremely important, and you're going to hear me talk a lot about that in some of my upcoming episodes. But that first 5 rounds it's important to get that nice base, but you want to focus on that injuries are going to happen, that trades are going to happen, that some breakout stars are going to come out that haven't been drafted by anybody. You're looking at Trey Lance and Justin Fields potentially going to get the starting spots at some point this season, but they aren't officially the starters now. They may not get drafted in your league. Those are players that may end up being big stars and big helpers to getting you into that final push of your fantasy football playoffs. Like I said, this is not your final roster. You have to, in fantasy football, we're playing a week-to-week game. It's not a season-long game. It's a week-to-week game that we play over the course of a season. Now, when you're actually drafting, rule number 4 to remember to keep in mind is going to be draft based upon value. Now, when we talk about different positions, I always say you want to stock up and load up on running backs really early because running back is the most valuable position in fantasy football. It's not the highest scoring position in fantasy football. No, that's the quarterback position. Wide receivers oftentimes outscore most running backs. They're oftentimes a safer pick than most running backs. As a matter of fact, Devontae Adams, the number 1 wide receiver in 2020, outscored all of the running backs in the NFL except for one, Alvin Kamara. And so he had a higher fantasy points total than every other running back outside of one running back. But the lack of depth and the attrition that running backs need to acquire in order to be a valuable running back make them a more likely candidate for injury. So in order to get an elite running back, that is one of the most important things in fantasy football. There's nothing more valuable than an elite top tier running back, a Derrick Henry, a Dalvin Cook, as long as they stay healthy. Now, with that being said, we always want to keep in mind that you do not want to be a slave to the rankings. I mean, when you're looking at fantasy football, nothing should be forced in any sense of the word. Just because running back is the most valuable and you have the 8th pick in your league and the first 8 picks go the top 8 running backs in the league, and now you're sitting there looking at Antonio Gibson and Joe Mixon thinking, man, I don't really want to go out and get them per se right now. I can maybe get them a little bit later or get somebody at a higher value than that player. Like I said, we're drafting based upon value. Don't be a slave to the rankings. If you think it's a better decision, if you value a player higher than what the rankings have them for whatever sense of the word, because every platform has players ranked in different ways. Well, like I said, if you're playing non-PPR versus PPR, that may affect how a wide receiver is ranked stacked up against a running back. Take in mind your different leagues' rules, and you're going to not be a slave to the rankings. And you're going to let everything come to you as it may. If all the first 8 running backs go off the board, then why don't you take Devontae Adams? I personally would take Devontae Adams over who I have ranked at running backs 8, 9, 10 in almost every sense of the word. Now, the very last rule that we got to discuss, and like I said, those first 5 rounds are very important. Typically, that first 5 rounds is the fantasy football version of your opening drive, and whoever can script those first 5 picks the best together will typically be in the best position to win the money at the end of the year. However, upside matters late, and that is going to be the 6th and final rule that you need to remember while going into your draft and going into preparation for your draft. Because you want to be those first 5 players, you want to minimize your risk. That's a big part of fantasy football is not having to take a ton of risk. You always kind of want to have those surefire players that you had, those set it and forget it style players. But outside of the first 5 rounds, you start running low on those risk-free options or risk-low options. So you start looking at players with high upside. Certain players with high upside may be a player that has no competition in his backfield and can get a lot of touches. You look at players like Adam Troutman from the Saints. I mean, Jared Cook is no longer there. He didn't have a very spectacular or even much to look at from his first season, but Jared Cook is no longer there. Michael Thomas is now having his injuries as well. He's going to be missing at least the first portion of the regular season, so that's a lot of target share. That player has a lot of upside. You're looking at players that may have a premier role, a starting role, a number 1 opportunity if they're only one injury away from said opportunity. Just like when we're looking at the Cam Akers injury in Los Angeles recently, now taking Darrell Henderson from being a late round pickup, a late round flyer, to being a mid-draft potential RB2 because he's now getting those sole opportunities in Los Angeles with the Rams. You're looking at players with massive upside in the late rounds in the draft, because towards the end of the draft, like I said, you start running out of those set it and forget it players. You're looking at those players that have big upside, and you're either looking at players that you want to mix it up. You're looking at some players that may have a nice role early on in the season. You're looking at some players that may step up into something later on in the season and help you on later in your playoff push. You want to mix it up and match it up, but at the end of the day, upside matters late. And those will be the 6 rules that we have for you to keep in mind. Number 1 is going to be know the lingo. Get to understand the fantasy football tongue. It's a whole different language pretty much. Then you also want to know your league's rules. That's the second most important thing that you need to know. I mean, I'm sitting here talking about a certain type of league, and you're playing a league that starts defensive players. I don't do that. I start defensive units. I don't start individual defensive players, but I have played in leagues before where I have to pick a defensive tackle, a linebacker, a cornerback. Get to know your league's rules so that way you can properly prepare for your league-specific draft. I mean, the third rule is going to be that this is not your final roster. You need to remember that. It's okay if you make a mistake. It's okay if you're not completely happy with your team after the draft. You need to not put too much effort into the draft, because at the end of the day, there are 13 more weeks after the draft that you can still make amends and that you can still make things right, and you can still completely ruin a good draft by not continuing on those next 13 weeks. So keep in mind that this is not your final roster. Now, the 4th rule is going to be draft based upon value. Don't be a slave to the rankings is number 5, and those almost go hand in hand. And then the last rule is going to be upside matters late. Those first 5 rounds are very important, but it's also at least 12 more rounds after those first 5 that are also just as important. Getting those upside players, getting those potential replacement options. You never know what's going to happen. Like we said, it's not your who you draft is not going to be your final roster. So you want to make sure you have those plug-and-play players, and you have those players that have massive upside later in the draft, because those players may be the difference and you winning the money and going home empty-handed. Thank you guys so much for being here today on the Fantasy Football Huddle presented by the Huddle Chat Sports. It's a pleasure being with you. Like I said, we're just now kicking off the official national draft weekend here. They're going to be doing that 24-hour marathon coming up here on ESPN. So I have a ton of content coming out over the next few days. Make sure you hit that notifications bell. Make sure you like my videos if you like my content. And I will see you next time, boys and girls. And as always, I hope your plants never stop growing and the news never stop showing. It's your boy, Indo is my Nindo, and I am the fuck up out of here. I'll see you next time. Holla.